On this quiet slope above the New River, a single-room log cabin still keeps watch. Built in 1836 by the Combs family, it sheltered 3 generations who carved a life from the Appalachian.
The forgotten truth behind the Hatfield cabin, the deadliest family of the Appalachian Mountains. I used to believe that the past was dead, that history existed only in books and museums, and the fading memories of old people who would soon take their stories to the grave. I used to believe that the feuds and vendettas that defined earlier generations of Americans had been civilized out of existence, replaced by courts and lawyers and social media arguments that never escalated beyond harsh words and blocked accounts. I used to believe that violence on the scale of the Hatfield-McCoy conflict was a relic of a primitive era, something that could never happen in modern America with its cameras and databases and 24-hour news cycles. I was wrong about all of it. The past is not dead. It is not even past. It lives in the hollows and ridges of the Appalachian Mountains, passed down through bloodlines that remember everything and forgive nothing, sustained by money and power and a code of silence that has kept the truth hidden for more than a century. I know this because I spent 4 months in the darkness beneath the old Hatfield cabin, listening to the screams of people whose only crime was getting in the way of interests that most Americans do not even know exist. I know this because I am one of the few people who has seen what happens in those tunnels and lived to tell about it. And I am telling it now because I am tired of being afraid, tired of looking over my shoulder, tired of pretending that what happened to me was anything other than exactly what I know it was. My name is Rebecca Chen. I was 34 years old in 2018, a true crime podcaster based in Brooklyn who had built a modest following producing investigative series about cold cases and historical mysteries. My show was called Blood Memory, and it focused on crimes that had shaped American culture in ways that most people did not recognize. I had done episodes on the Lindbergh kidnapping, the Black Dahlia murder, the Zodiac killer, and dozens of lesser-known cases that I believed deserved more attention than they had received. I was not famous, but I was respected within my niche, known for thorough research and a willingness to travel to the places where crimes had occurred rather than simply reading about them from the comfort of my apartment. When I decided to produce a series about the Hatfield-McCoy feud, I thought I was embarking on a nostalgic journey into Appalachian history, a chance to explore how a legendary conflict had shaped the region and its people. I had no idea that I was walking into a story that was still being written in blood. The Hatfield-McCoy feud is one of the most famous conflicts in American history. A decades-long vendetta between two families living on opposite sides of the Tug Fork River along the West Virginia-Kentucky border. The conventional narrative holds that the feud began in the aftermath of the Civil War, when lingering tensions between Union and Confederate sympathizers combined with disputes over land, timber, and a stolen pig to ignite a cycle of violence that claimed dozens of lives between 1,863 and 1,891. The Hatfields, led by the legendary devil Anse Hatfield, controlled the West Virginia side. The McCoys, led by Randolph McCoy, dominated the Kentucky side. The killings, ambushes, and retaliatory raids that characterized the conflict became national news, transforming both families into symbols of Appalachian backwardness and violence. When the feud officially ended in 1891 with the execution of Ellison Mounts for his role in the New Year's Night Massacre, the story was supposed to be over. The families made peace, the violence stopped, the region moved on. That is the story I believed when I arrived in the Tug Fork Valley in the spring of 2018. I had spent months researching the historical record, reading court documents and newspaper accounts, and the numerous books that had been written about the feud over the past century. I had contacted descendants of both families, many of whom had become minor celebrities through their connection to the famous conflict, appearing in documentaries and reality television shows that traded on the Hatfield-McCoy brand. I had arranged interviews with historians, genealogists, and local officials who promised to help me understand how the feud continued to shape the region's identity more than a century after the last acknowledged killing. I arrived with recording equipment, cameras, and the naive confidence of someone who believed that the truth was something you could find by asking enough questions and following enough leads. I did not understand that some truths are buried so deep that finding them means being buried yourself. My first weeks in the region were exactly what I had expected. I conducted interviews with descendants of both families, most of whom were happy to share stories that had been passed down through generations. They told me about Devil Anse and Randolph McCoy, about the pig trial and the election day fight, about Rosanna McCoy's doomed romance with John Hatfield, and the New Year's Night massacre that killed Randolph McCoy's wife and children. They showed me family photographs and heirlooms, took me to cemeteries where the feudists were buried, and pointed out landmarks where famous incidents had occurred. They were proud of their heritage, eager to perpetuate the legend that had made their families famous, and generous with their time and their hospitality. I recorded hours of interviews and captured footage that I knew would make compelling content for my podcast. Everything was going according to plan. The problems began when I started asking questions that went beyond the established narrative. I had noticed, during my research, certain inconsistencies in the historical record that no one seemed to have explored. The official death toll from the feud was usually cited as approximately a dozen people, but references in newspaper accounts and court documents suggested that the actual number might be significantly higher. Certain names appeared in connection with violent incidents and then disappeared from the record entirely, as though the people attached to those names had simply ceased to exist. Property transactions in the decades following the feud showed patterns that suggested coordinated acquisition of land by interests connected to the Hatfield family, acquisitions that coincided with the disappearance of previous owners under circumstances that were never fully explained. I began asking my interview subjects about these discrepancies, expecting them to offer clarifications or corrections that would help me understand what had really happened. Instead, I encountered something I had never experienced before in my career, a wall of silence so complete that it felt almost rehearsed. The first person to refuse to speak with me was an elderly woman named Loretta Hatfield Blankenship, a great-great-granddaughter of Devil Anse who had initially been one of my most enthusiastic sources. When I asked her about a land transaction from 1,923 inches, which her grandfather had acquired a significant tract of property from a family that subsequently left the region under unclear circumstances, her demeanor changed completely. She told me that some questions were better left unasked, that I should focus on the stories that people wanted to tell rather than digging for things that would only cause trouble. When I pressed her for specifics, she ended the interview and asked me to leave her property. Similar encounters followed with other descendants who had previously been cooperative. The moment I raised questions about events that fell outside the conventional feud narrative, doors closed, phones stopped being answered, and I found myself increasingly isolated in a community that had initially welcomed me. I should have recognized the warning signs. I should have understood that the sudden change in attitude indicated something more significant than mere reluctance to discuss family secrets. But I was a journalist, trained to pursue stories that powerful people wanted to suppress, and the resistance I encountered only convinced me that I was onto something important. I began conducting research without the cooperation of local sources. digging through courthouse records, property archives, and newspaper morgues in search of documentation that might explain what had happened in the decades after the feud officially ended. What I found was fragmentary but suggestive. References to violent incidents that had never been prosecuted, disappearances that had never been investigated, patterns of land acquisition that could not be explained by normal market forces. I began to develop a theory that the Hatfield family, or at least certain branches of it, had continued operating as an organized force long after the feud was supposed to have ended, using their reputation for violence and their control of remote mountain territory for purposes that went far beyond the personal vendettas of the 19th century. The breakthrough came when I located a former coal company executive named Warren Phillips, who had worked for one of the major mining operations in the region during the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds. Phillips was in his 80s, living in a retirement community in Florida, and suffering from a terminal illness that had apparently loosened his tongue about matters he would never have discussed earlier in his life. He agreed to speak with me by phone, and what he told me over the course of a 3-hour conversation changed everything I thought I knew about the Hatfield family and their legacy. Phillips told me that the coal companies had maintained relationships with certain local families since the early days of industrialization in Appalachia, relationships that went far beyond normal employment or land leasing arrangements. These families provided services that the companies could not obtain through legitimate channels: intimidation of union organizers, elimination of property owners who refused to sell mineral rights, disposal of problems that threatened the smooth operation of the extraction economy. The Hatfields, he said, had been among the most reliable providers of these services for more than a century. Their reputation from the feud made them perfect for the role. Everyone knew they were capable of violence. Everyone knew they controlled territory where bodies could disappear forever. And everyone knew that crossing them meant consequences that no court or law enforcement agency would be able to prevent or punish. Phillips described specific incidents from his time with the coal company, incidents in which he had personal knowledge of payments made to Hatfield family members for services that he described in euphemistic terms. He spoke of union organizers who had been found dead in circumstances that were ruled accidental. He spoke of landowners who had refused to sell and then vanished, their properties subsequently acquired by the company at prices far below market value. He spoke of a network of tunnels beneath the original Hatfield homestead, tunnels that had been used during Prohibition to store and transport illegal liquor but had taken on other purposes as the family's business evolved. He told me that the bodies of people who had gotten in the way of the coal industry's interests were buried in those tunnels, that the number of victims over the decades probably exceeded 100, and that everyone in the region who mattered knew about it, but no one would ever say anything because the consequences of speaking were too terrible to contemplate. I recorded the entire conversation, my hands trembling as Phillips described horrors that seemed impossible in modern America, but that he insisted were ongoing. He told me that he was speaking now only because he was dying, because he had nothing left to lose, and because he hoped that someone would finally expose the truth that he and so many others had helped to conceal. He gave me names, dates, locations, and details that I could use to verify his account. He told me where to look for evidence and who to avoid while looking. And he warned me, repeatedly and emphatically, to be extremely careful, because the people I was investigating had been eliminating threats for more than a century and had become very good at it. I took his warnings seriously, or I thought I did. I began investigating more covertly, using fake names when possible, avoiding direct contact with Hatfield family members, and focusing my research on documentary evidence rather than interviews. I spent weeks in archives and courthouses, assembling a paper trail that supported Phillips's account. I found death certificates for people whose causes of death were listed as accident or unknown, but whose circumstances suggested violence. I found property records showing transfers that coincided with disappearances. I found newspaper articles that hinted at incidents that were never fully reported, crimes that were never prosecuted, patterns that became visible only when you knew what to look for. The evidence was not conclusive, but it was suggestive enough that I believed I had the foundation for a major investigative series that would expose a century of hidden violence. My mistake was visiting the old Hatfield cabin. The structure, which had been preserved as a historical landmark and was open to tourists during certain hours, sat at the center of the territory that Anse had controlled during the height of the feud. I had avoided it during my earlier research, believing that it would be under surveillance by family members who were already suspicious of my activities. But I needed to see the property for myself, to understand the geography of the area, to identify locations where the tunnels Phillips had described might be located. I decided to visit on a weekday morning when tourist traffic would be minimal, telling myself that I would simply walk the grounds and take photographs like any other visitor. I did not expect to find anything definitive. I certainly did not expect to be found myself. I arrived at the cabin property around 10 in the morning on a Tuesday in late June. The weather was warm and clear, and the mountains that surrounded the valley were lush with summer growth. The cabin itself was smaller than I had expected, a rough log structure that had been partially restored but still showed the wear of more than a century of existence. A few other tourists were wandering the grounds, taking photographs and reading the historical placards that described the feud and its principal figures. I joined them, trying to look like just another visitor interested in Appalachian history, while surreptitiously studying the terrain for signs of the underground structures that Phillips had described. I noticed several outbuildings scattered around the main cabin, structures that the historical placards identified as a smokehouse, a storage shed, and a spring house. One of these buildings, set slightly apart from the others and partially concealed by vegetation, did not have a placard and did not appear on the tourist map I had been given at the entrance. I walked toward it, camera in hand, pretending to photograph the surrounding landscape while actually studying the structure for any indication of its purpose. As I got closer, I noticed that the ground around the building was more heavily worn than the areas around the other outbuildings, as though it received regular foot traffic that the tourist paths did not explain. I also noticed, partially hidden by undergrowth, what appeared to be the outline of a door set into the ground at an angle, like the entrance to a root cellar or storm shelter. I was so focused on what I had found that I did not notice the man approaching me from behind until he spoke. His voice was calm, almost friendly, asking if I was lost or looking for something specific. I turned to find a man in his 50s, lean and weathered, with eyes that studied me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I told him I was just a tourist, that I was interested in the feud history, that I had wandered off the main path by accident. He nodded as if he believed me, but his eyes never left my face, and I could see in them a calculation that suggested he knew exactly who I was and what I was doing. He introduced himself as Elijah Hatfield, a descendant of Anse who helped maintain the property and served as an informal guide for visitors who wanted more information than the placards provided. He offered to show me around, to share stories that were not included in the official tourist materials. I accepted because refusing would have confirmed whatever suspicions he already had, and because part of me still believed that I was in control of the situation that my cover story was holding, that I could extract myself whenever I chose. I was wrong. Elijah led me away from the other tourists, toward a section of the property that was marked as off-limits due to ongoing restoration work. He talked continuously as we walked, telling stories about the feud that I had heard many times before, pointing out features of the landscape that held historical significance. I recorded the conversation on my phone, which I kept in my jacket pocket with the microphone activated, telling myself that I was gathering material for my podcast, even as a growing sense of unease made me consider turning back. By the time I realized that we had walked far enough from the main property that no one would hear me if I screamed, it was too late. 2 other men emerged from the tree line, moving to block my path of retreat, and Elijah's friendly demeanor vanished as completely as if it had never existed. They took my phone, my camera, my recording equipment, and my identification. They bound my hands and put a hood over my head, eliminating my ability to see where they were taking me. They walked me through the forest for what felt like at least an hour, guiding me over rough terrain, occasionally lifting me over obstacles that I could not see. Eventually, we stopped, and I heard the sound of a heavy door being opened. The temperature dropped as I was led down a flight of stone stairs, and the acoustic quality of the space around me changed from the open air of the forest to the enclosed stillness of an underground chamber. The hood was removed, and I found myself in a tunnel carved from rock, lit by electric lights that hummed with a low, constant drone. The walls were rough-hewn stone, the floor was packed earth, and the passage extended in both directions beyond the reach of the lights. I was deep underground, beneath the mountain, in the tunnels that Warren Phillips had described. What followed was the worst experience of my life. They kept me in a cell cut into the rock, one of many such cells that lined a section of the tunnel system. I was questioned repeatedly about who I was, who I had spoken to, what I had learned, and who else knew about my investigation. I told them the truth because I had no reason to protect anyone and because the consequences of lying were demonstrated to me in ways that I will not describe. I told them about Warren Phillips and the phone conversation we had had. I told them about the research I had conducted in archives and courthouses. I told them about the evidence I had assembled and where I had stored it. They listened carefully, asked follow-up questions, and eventually seemed satisfied that they understood the full scope of my investigation and who else might know about it. I later learned that Warren Phillips died in his sleep approximately 1 week after my capture, his death attributed to natural causes related to his terminal illness. I have no proof that his death was anything other than coincidental, but I do not believe in coincidences anymore. I believe that the Hatfields have been tying up loose ends for more than a century, and that an elderly man in a Florida retirement community presented no more difficulty for them than the union organizers and stubborn landowners of earlier generations. During my captivity, I learned the full scope of what the Hatfield organization had become. The family had evolved from feudists to enforcers to something that resembled a private military company operating in the shadows of legitimate industry. Their clients included coal companies, timber companies, pipeline operators, and real estate developers who needed obstacles removed without the complications of legal process. They also worked with organized crime syndicates from cities across the eastern United States, providing disposal services for bodies that needed to disappear. and sanctuary for fugitives who could pay for protection. The tunnels beneath the original cabin were just one part of a network that extended throughout the mountains, connecting to abandoned mines, natural caves, and purpose-built chambers that had been excavated over generations. The bodies of victims dating back decades were buried in these tunnels, their identities erased, their disappearances never investigated, their families left to wonder forever what had happened to them. The romantic legend of the Hatfield-McCoy feud provided perfect cover for the operation. The family encouraged the tourist industry that had grown up around their history, welcoming documentary crews and reality television producers who helped maintain the image of colorful mountain characters whose violent past was safely behind them. The descendants who appeared on camera were carefully chosen for their ability to play the role of reformed feudists, proud of their heritage but fully integrated into modern American society. The other descendants, the ones who ran the actual family business, never appeared on camera and never spoke to outsiders. They operated in the shadows, maintaining the infrastructure that had been built over a century, eliminating anyone who threatened to expose the truth. I spent 4 months in those tunnels. I was not physically abused after the initial questioning, but I was kept in conditions designed to break down my sense of self and my connection to the world I had left behind. I was fed irregularly, kept in darkness for extended periods, and denied any contact with other prisoners except for brief glimpses during transfers between sections of the tunnel system. I heard screams sometimes, sounds that echoed through the rock and reached my cell without any indication of their source or cause. I learned to distinguish between different types of screams, to identify which ones meant interrogation and which ones meant something worse. I learned things about human cruelty that I had never wanted to know. Lessons that have stayed with me every day since my escape. The other prisoners I encountered were a cross-section of people who had gotten in the way of powerful interests. There was a labor organizer who had been trying to unionize a non-union mine. There was a property owner who had refused to grant an easement for a gas pipeline. There was a journalist from a regional newspaper who had been investigating corruption in local government. There was a woman whose only crime, as far as I could determine, was being related to someone who owed money to the wrong people. They had been brought to the tunnels because they represented problems that could not be solved through legitimate means, and they would remain there until the family decided what to do with them. Some would be released after suitable intimidation ensured their silence. Some would be held indefinitely as leverage against family members or associates. Some would simply disappear into the deeper sections of the tunnel network, joining the remains of a century of victims and graves that would never be found. I escaped in late October, during a period of disruption caused by an accident at one of the coal operations that the family was connected to. The accident required resources and attention that would normally have been devoted to maintaining security in the tunnels, and for a brief period, the guards who patrolled my section were redeployed elsewhere. I had been preparing for an escape attempt for weeks, accumulating small items that might be useful, memorizing the routines of the guards, studying the layout of the tunnel section I could observe from my cell. When the opportunity came, I was ready. I managed to work the lock on my cell using a piece of metal I had scavenged from my food tray, slipped into the corridor during a gap in the patrol schedule, and made my way through passages I had never seen before, following the flow of air that I hoped would lead me to the surface. The details of my escape are less important than the fact that I survived it. I emerged from a ventilation shaft about 3 miles from the main Hatfield property, in a section of forest so remote that I could see no sign of human habitation in any direction. I was weak from months of captivity, malnourished, dehydrated, and suffering from injuries I had sustained during the escape. I walked for 2 days, following streams and ridge lines, before I finally reached a road where a passing driver picked me up and took me to a hospital in Charleston. I told the authorities everything I had experienced. I gave them detailed descriptions of the tunnel system, the locations of entrances and exits I had observed, the names and faces of family members I had encountered. I provided information about other prisoners who were still being held, people whose families might still be looking for them, people who might still be saved if someone acted quickly. The response was exactly what Warren Phillips had warned me to expect. The authorities investigated my claims and found nothing. They searched the area around the Hatfield property and found no entrances to underground tunnels. They interviewed family members who expressed concern for my mental health and suggested that I might have experienced some kind of breakdown. They consulted with medical professionals who noted that prolonged captivity could produce false memories and paranoid delusions. Within a few weeks, the official position was that I had suffered a psychiatric episode of uncertain origin and that my account of the tunnels and their contents was not credible. I tried other channels. I contacted journalists who had covered organized crime and corporate corruption. I reached out to advocacy organizations that focused on missing persons and human trafficking. I attempted to interest federal agencies in investigating what I described as a century-old criminal enterprise operating with impunity in the heart of Appalachia. No one believed me. The few who took my calls listened politely and then explained that my story was too extraordinary to pursue without corroborating evidence that I could not provide. The recordings I had made, the research I had assembled, the documentation I had gathered, all of it had been confiscated during my capture and presumably destroyed. I had nothing but my memory and my word was not enough to overcome the skepticism of people who could not believe that such an operation could exist without having been exposed long ago. The 5 years since my escape have been defined by my failure to convince anyone of the truth. I left journalism entirely, unable to continue working in a field that had provided no support when I needed it most. I moved across the country, settling in a city as far from Appalachia as I could get while remaining in the continental United States. I changed my name, cut off contact with most of the people from my former life, and tried to build something new in the wreckage of everything I had lost. The nightmares continued. The hypervigilance that made me jump at unexpected sounds and scan every room for exits never faded. The conviction that I was being watched, that the Hatfields knew where I was and were simply waiting for the right moment to silence me permanently, became a constant presence that I could not shake no matter how many therapists told me that my fears were irrational. I am writing this now because I have decided that the fear has controlled me long enough. I am writing this because the people I left behind in those tunnels, the prisoners I could not save, deserve to have their stories told even if no one believes them. I am writing this because the legend of the Hatfield-McCoy feud continues to attract tourists and documentary crews and reality television producers, all of them participating in a mythology that conceals an ongoing atrocity. And someone needs to challenge that mythology, even if the challenge is doomed to fail. I am writing this because I am tired of silence, tired of hiding, tired of pretending that what happened to me was anything other than exactly what I know it was. The Hatfield family is still operating. The tunnels beneath the old cabin are still in use. The bodies of victims are still buried in chambers carved from mountain rock. The clients who need problems to disappear are still making payments through channels that law enforcement has never traced. The legend of the deadliest family in American history is still being polished and promoted, sold to audiences who have no idea that the violence they find so fascinating never actually ended. It just went underground, literally, and it has been there ever since. Protected by isolation and reputation and a wall of silence that has held for more than a century. I cannot stop this. I have tried for 5 years and I have failed. But I can leave a record. I can describe what I saw and what I learned during my captivity. I can provide details that might help a determined investigator find evidence that the official investigations overlooked or deliberately ignored. I can do this much, and I intend to do it while I still have the strength. The original Hatfield cabin sits on property that has been in the family since before the Civil War. The tunnels beneath it were originally dug in the 1,880 expanded during Prohibition, and systematically developed in the decades since to accommodate the family's evolving business needs. The main entrance that I was taken through is located in an outbuilding approximately 200 yards northeast of the cabin, concealed by a structure that appears to be a storage shed but contains a reinforced door leading to stone stairs that descend approximately 30 feet to the main tunnel level. Other entrances exist throughout the surrounding mountains, connected to the main complex by passages that extend for miles in multiple directions. The tunnels I saw could accommodate hundreds of people if necessary, and the infrastructure I observed, ventilation systems, electrical wiring, plumbing, suggested that the complex was designed for long-term occupation. The family structure is hierarchical, with leadership positions passed down through specific bloodlines that trace their ancestry directly to Devil Anse Hatfield. The current head of the family when I was captured was a man in his 70s named Isaiah Hatfield, who was treated with deference by everyone I encountered and who made the final decisions about what happened to prisoners and how the family's business was conducted. Below him were lieutenants who managed specific aspects of the operation: security, logistics, client relations, disposal. Below them were workers who performed the physical labor of maintaining the tunnels, guarding prisoners, and carrying out whatever tasks the family's business required. The total number of people involved in the operation was difficult to estimate, but I saw at least 50 different faces during my captivity, and there were clearly sections of the complex that I never accessed. The clients I learned about included companies in the extractive industries, specifically coal and natural gas, who had used the family's services to remove obstacles to their operations. I heard references to specific incidents involving people who had opposed pipeline construction, mining permits, and land acquisitions. I also heard references to organized crime figures from cities including Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, and Cleveland, who used the family's services for disposal and sanctuary. The payments for these services were substantial, large enough to maintain the infrastructure I observed and to provide comfortable lives for the family members who managed the operation. If you are reading this and you have the resources to investigate, here is what I ask of you. Do not approach the Hatfield property directly. The family has surveillance and security that will detect any intrusion, and they will respond with the same efficiency they have demonstrated for more than a century. Instead, follow the connections I have described. Investigate the extractive industry companies that have operated in the region and look for patterns of violence and disappearance associated with their operations. Investigate the organized crime connections that link the family to criminal enterprises in major cities. Look for financial transactions that might reveal the payments the family receives for its services. Most importantly, do not give up when you encounter resistance. The wall of silence that has protected the Hatfields for generations is not impenetrable. It is maintained by fear and complicity, and both of those things can be overcome by people who are determined enough to try. I know how this account will be received. I know that I will be dismissed as a mentally unstable woman whose traumatic experiences have distorted her perception of reality. I know that the Hatfield family will deny everything I have written, that their lawyers will threaten anyone who repeats my claims, that the wall of silence will hold as it has held for more than a century. But I also know what I saw. I know what I heard. I know that there are people buried in those tunnels who deserve justice, and that there are people still living in those tunnels who deserve rescue. I cannot provide that justice or that rescue myself. All I can do is tell the truth and hope that someone, somewhere, has the courage to act on it. The legend of the Hatfield-McCoy feud is a story about violence that ended, about families that made peace, about a region that moved on from its bloody past. It is a comforting story, a story that allows tourists to visit the old cabin and take photographs and buy souvenirs without confronting the possibility that the violence never really ended, but it is a lie. The violence did not end. It evolved. It professionalized. It found new clients and new purposes. And it is happening right now, beneath the mountains that millions of Americans visit every year, hidden in plain sight behind a legend that no one has ever thought to question. This is my testimony. This is what I know. This is everything I can offer to the cause of truth and justice. My name is Rebecca Chen. I spent 4 months in the tunnels beneath the old Hatfield cabin. I escaped with my life, but lost everything else. I have spent 5 years trying to convince someone to investigate what I experienced. I have failed. But I am still here. I am still telling the story, and I will keep telling it until someone finally listens. The deadliest family in America is not a legend. They are real. They are still operating. And they are waiting for the next person who gets too close to the truth. Do not let it be you. But do not let them continue either. Someone has to stop them. Someone has to try. I hope that someone is reading this right now. Before I finish this account, I want to address some things that I have thought about every day since my escape. Things that haunt me more than the memories of the tunnels themselves. Things that I believe are essential for understanding the full scope of what the Hatfield organization has become and why it has been able to operate with impunity for so long. The first is the question of complicity. During my captivity, I learned that the Hatfield operation did not exist in isolation. It was embedded in a network of relationships that extended far beyond the mountains, touching institutions and individuals that most Americans would consider beyond reproach. I heard conversations about payments to law enforcement officials at local, state, and federal levels. I heard references to politicians who received campaign contributions in exchange for ensuring that regulations remained lax and investigations remained unfunded. I heard about journalists who had been intimidated or bought off, about prosecutors who had declined to pursue cases that threatened powerful interests, about judges who had ruled in ways that protected the family's operations from legal scrutiny. The corruption was systemic, woven into the fabric of regional power structures in ways that made it almost impossible to challenge. This complicity explains why my attempts to expose the truth have failed so consistently. When I contacted law enforcement, I was reporting to agencies that had long-standing relationships with the people I was accusing. When I reached out to journalists, I was approaching publications that depended on advertising revenue from companies connected to the family's clients. When I tried to interest federal agencies, I was dealing with bureaucracies that had institutional reasons to avoid confronting the powerful interests that benefited from the family's services. The system was not designed to investigate itself. It was designed to protect itself. And I was just one person, without resources or connections, trying to challenge a century of accumulated power. The second thing I want to address is the question of the victims. During my 4 months in the tunnels, I encountered approximately 24 other prisoners, most of them held in conditions similar to mine. They came from different backgrounds and had been captured for different reasons, but they shared certain characteristics that I believe are important for understanding who the family targets. Most of them were people who had challenged powerful interests in some way. Labor organizers, environmental activists, investigative journalists, property owners who refused to sell. A few were simply people who had stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time, like the tourist who occasionally wandered too far from the maintained paths and saw things they were not supposed to see. All of them were people whose disappearances could be explained away, whose families would be told that they had run away or met with accidents or suffered from mental illness that led them to vanish voluntarily. I think about these people constantly. I think about the labor organizer named Marcus who told me about his family in Ohio, his wife and 2 children who had no idea where he was or whether he was still alive. I think about the journalist named Sandra who had been investigating connections between a coal company and a state legislator who had gotten too close to something that the family's clients needed to remain hidden. I think about the elderly man named Henry, whose crime was owning land that sat above natural gas deposits, who had refused to sign an easement that would have allowed a pipeline to cross his property. I think about all the people I saw in those tunnels, the faces that I memorized, because I knew that I might be the only person who could ever tell their stories. And I wonder how many of them are still alive. How many of them have been disposed of in the deeper sections of the tunnel network? How many of them are waiting right now for a rescue that will never come? The third thing I want to address is the question of what can be done. I have spent 5 years trying to answer this question, and I do not have a satisfying response. The family's operation is protected by layers of security, complicity, and silence that have resisted every attempt to penetrate them. The evidence that could prove my claims is buried in tunnels that I cannot access, guarded by people who would kill me if they found me, and the only witnesses who could corroborate my account are either dead, still imprisoned, or too frightened to speak. The conventional tools of exposure, journalism, law enforcement, advocacy, have failed because they are designed for a world where institutions can be trusted to investigate themselves. That world does not exist in the Tug Fork Valley. It may never have existed there, but I refuse to believe that the situation is hopeless. I refuse to accept that a criminal organization can operate indefinitely without eventually being exposed. History teaches us that even the most powerful systems contain vulnerabilities, that truth has a way of emerging even from the deepest darkness, that evil eventually collapses under its own weight. The question is how to find those vulnerabilities and exploit them, how to create the conditions under which the truth can finally emerge. My hope is that this account will reach someone who has resources that I do not have. Perhaps a wealthy individual who has been personally affected by the family's operations and who has the means to fund a private investigation that does not depend on compromised institutions. Perhaps a team of journalists from an outlet that cannot be intimidated, working together to verify the claims I have made and to find the evidence that would make those claims undeniable. Perhaps a whistleblower from within the organization itself, someone who has grown tired of the violence and the secrecy, and who is willing to provide information that could bring the whole structure down. I do not know who this person is or whether they exist, but I have to believe that they are out there, that someone is reading this right now and deciding whether to act on what they have learned. If you are that person, I have a few final pieces of advice. First, trust no one in the region until they have proven themselves trustworthy through actions rather than words. The family has informants throughout the local population, people who are paid to report on strangers asking questions and to identify potential threats to the operation. Second, document everything you discover and store it in multiple locations that cannot be compromised simultaneously. The family has demonstrated its ability to make evidence disappear, and the only protection against this is redundancy. Third, be prepared for resistance from unexpected sources. The complicity I described extends to institutions that you might assume would be allies, and you cannot take for granted that anyone in a position of authority is genuinely interested in exposing the truth. Fourth, and most importantly, do not underestimate the danger. The people you are investigating have been killing those who threaten them for more than a century. They are efficient, patient, and utterly ruthless. If they identify you as a threat, they will eliminate you without hesitation or remorse. I have taken precautions with this account. I have stored copies in multiple locations, with instructions for release if anything happens to me. I have arranged for the account to be distributed through channels that the family cannot easily intercept or suppress. I have done everything I can think of to ensure that my testimony survives even if I do not. Whether these precautions are sufficient remains to be seen. The family has resources and expertise that I cannot match, and I am under no illusions about my ability to outsmart them indefinitely. But I have to try. I owe it to the people I left behind in those tunnels. I owe it to myself, and I owe it to whatever remains of my belief that truth and justice still mean something in this world. The legend of the Hatfield-McCoy feud tells us that the violence ended, that the families made peace, that the past is safely contained in museum exhibits and historical markers and reality television shows. The legend is a lie. The violence never ended. It just changed form, adapted to new circumstances, found new clients and new victims. The deadliest family in America is still operating, still killing, still burying bodies in tunnels that wind through the mountains like the roots of a poisonous tree. And they will continue operating until someone finally has the courage and the resources to stop them. This is Rebecca Chen, signing off from a location I will not disclose. I have told you everything I know. The rest is up to you. May God protect whoever decides to take up this fight, and may He have mercy on the souls of all those who have suffered in the darkness beneath the Hatfield cabin. The feud never ended. It is happening right now, and it will not stop until someone makes it stop.